Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be talking about an interesting but also precautionary tale from one of the world's biggest animation and film studios. Yes, that is if you're doing a task big or small, you're normally reminded to back up your work to make sure that you don't lose all your work. I mean, if you lose the only copy of the paper you're working on, you might have to work a few late nights to catch back up. But if you're a multi-million-dollar company and something like that happens, you're going to lose much more. Hello! Welcome to Brain Spill, the laziest show on the internet. My name is Tank, and if the title didn't give it away already, the company we're talking about today is the Pixar Animation Studio. I can almost guarantee that everyone has seen a Pixar film in their life. The company that has brought you animations such as Finding Nemo, Monsters Inc., Up, and of course, Toy Story. I absolutely loved Toy Story growing up, and it just so happened that the films were released at the same time that I was growing up with Andy, so it has a particularly close place in my heart. And of course, I had the VHS, I had all the toys, I was pretty into Toy Story. Toy Story was the company's first full feature-length film, released in 1995. It was very much an international success. After a run of further films released by the studio and the critical acclaim Toy Story had, it only made sense for a sequel to this popular film to start being made. And of course, with Toy Story's success, the bar was set high indeed. And in 1998, whilst the team were working on the release of A Bug's Life, the question was proposed whether there would be a Toy Story 2. Disney had started making their sequels to popular films straight-to-video home releases, after seeing film sequels such as Aladdin: Return of Jafar making approximately $100 million in profit. The green light was given for a sequel to be made for Toy Story. When a team was eventually brought together to start work on the movie, they began using some assets and models from the first Toy Story film and a few other projects they'd been working on. But the majority of character models received major upgrades internally, and shaders went throughout the revisions to bring about subtle improvements to character designs. The studio had always worked in a standard of perfectionism, so, as you might expect, the process to produce a film such as this was a heavy investment in both time and expense. And I want to stress, when I say time, I mean a lot of time was put into this. Originally, there were concerns that the project was not moving at the pace expected by Disney, and in June 1997, after a reshuffle of the producers, the Disney executives sat down and viewed some storyboards, test reels and animation segments that had been completed up until that point. The team were so impressed by this, in fact, that they decided to change the idea of the film being released on a straight-to-VHS release to this being a theatrical release, which was a bit of a shock to everybody. I mean, come to think of it, if you're working on the film, it's fantastic that they think your project is good. You obviously want to make it as best quality as it possibly can be. However, the release date was not changed. 1998, just 1 year from this point, was still the deadline for the team. And now that it was going to be potentially a theatrical release, they really had to get their ass in gear. This, for any animation studio, is a tall order, but off the back of one of the most hotly anticipated films of the year, it's going to be even more difficult. Karen Jackson, co-producer on the film, commented on this and said the following: "When we went from a direct-to-video to a feature film and we had limited time in which to finish that feature film, the pressure really amped up. Forget seeing your family, forget doing anything. Once we made that decision, it was like, okay, you have a release date, you're going to make that release date. You're going to make these screenings." There's a book called Creativity Inc., published in 2014 by Pixar co-founder Ed Catmull, which is very insightful with the birth and the development of Pixar, the vision they had, and at its core, a manual on how to sustain creative culture. The book delves into the details of the many major milestones that the studio managed to accomplish up until present day, really. But one thing that they do go into detail with as well is the troubled development of this film, Toy Story 2. After renegotiation with Pixar over the film, the plans were changed for a theatrical release and work got underway to make this project bigger and better than it was ever before. The expectation and demand was certainly mounting, and to understand the complexity of this project, you need to understand the amount of work that goes into the full production of an animation like this. There is a whole host of people working remotely in all different fields, such as writers, storyboard designers, artists, modelers, animators, and so on. All of these different people from all of these different sides of the project all needed access to pretty much the same assets, as they were working very closely together during the production of the film. They basically needed a central point where everything was stored to ensure that everybody was running off the same crib sheet. So that is what they did. They had a central system where everything was stored into it, so everybody could work into weaving a tapestry of this film. This database was being housed internally in Studio so that anybody could access the files when they were there. Now, these machines storing the files were Linux machines, and for those of you not familiar with how this works, you would operate Linux via command line operations. This means that to access and use files, you would need to enter certain commands into the machine to carry out specific commands. One day, an animator working on the film was routinely doing some file cleanup on the machines, and they entered a command which simply read this. So, what you may be asking is, what does this mean? Well, this is code that is entered effectively to ensure that if you're deleting or removing a file, it gets rid of it as quickly as possible and just clears it off the system, which is all well and good if you're looking to remove individual files, which people did a lot of the time. However, there was a particularly big problem with this particular code and why it caused so much heartache for everybody working on the project. The problem arose when this command was inputted. It wasn't selecting an individual file. This command was inputted on the root folder for the entire project, meaning that as soon as the command was entered, all the files inside this folder started getting deleted as quickly as possible, which up until this point was pretty much everything the team had been working on for the past year. You would have thought a prompt like this would have been double checked by the user before it started deleting things, but this is a Linux we're talking about here. This unnamed Pixar employee, once he did this, probably realised the absolutely massive cock-up he'd done, and to be fair, he probably got an absolute bollocking for it, and who knows, maybe he is now working at DreamWorks. You just never know. Associate Technical Director Oren Jacob was one of the first to notice as character models disappeared from the works in progress. They'd noticed that certain assets were disappearing, such as Woody's hat, then his boots. Then Woody himself disappeared, almost like he'd been snapped out of existence by Thanos. Then again, other character models started disappearing also during the work in progress systems. It was at this point that Oren soon realised what was happening and managed to put two and two together. And to be honest, if anyone was going to pick up on this, it was going to be Oren. Then we saw sequences start to vanish as well, and we were like, oh my god. I grabbed the phone. Unplug the machine! Oren immediately picked up the phone to the IT team and ordered them to pull the plug. They questioned the request and he didn't give them the opportunity to explain it. He demanded that the plug was pulled immediately. After some hesitation, the systems department obliged. The plug was pulled and the command that started running was stopped. By doing this, they were essentially pulling the plug on a system that hundreds of people were having access to at the same time. So no wonder the technical team were hesitant to do this. I can imagine the actual incident of panic having more profanity involved, but you get the idea. Once this was done, they plugged everything back in and saw what remained of the Toy Story 2 project. And, well, they determined that upwards of 90% of everything they had for the film had been erased. Yes, this was the film that was due to be released in less than a year's time, and due to one command being entered, they'd lost nearly the entire movie. Oh my days, the sinking feeling must have been absolutely gut-wrenching. I mean, you and me both know that there is a Toy Story 2 film out there, so it makes you wonder, how did they save this? Well, Galen Sussman, technical director of the film, was soon informed as to what had happened, and she suggested just recovering a backup of the files. I mean, that's a very logical thing to do, come to think of it. These days it likely wouldn't happen like this with everything being backed up on the cloud to have a permanent backup, but this was the 90s and it wasn't quite as simple then. If you wanted a backup of something, you needed a physical backup of whatever project it is that you wanted backing up. And I mean, for a $500 million animation company, you'd think that they'd have some form of backup, right? Well, no. Apparently the backups hadn't been working for the past month when this just so happened to have occurred, meaning that there was no backup and they were pretty much screwed. They had nothing to go off. They had lost 90% of everything they'd been working on for the past few years. Meaning that an emergency meeting was called from the higher-ups at Pixar to determine the fate of the film. If this meant pushing it back, or if they could start the project again, whether they just scrap it altogether. If a solution was never found, we may have only had one Toy Story film ever released, and the subsequent films we all know and love today may never have even happened. That is a timeline that I don't want to live in. But to be honest, as a silver lining, if Toy Story 2 and 3 never happened, I would never have cried like a little bitch in the cinema at Toy Story 3, so silver linings, I guess. Galen mentioned in this meeting that she may just in fact have a backup of her own at home. Maybe. Which gave a shred of light to everybody in there, hoping and praying that she was right and that they had something to salvage. So they got to work. This could have been the glimmer of hope they needed to save the film. How recent was the backup? Did it have all of the files they lost? Did she forget and realise that it was a backup of an entirely different film? Who knows? The anticipation from the team on this new piece of information, I can only imagine, must have been immense. The reason she thought she had a backup was that, as a mother to a newborn baby, she wanted the ability to work remotely on the film, and to do that, she needed a copy to take away with her. Due to not being in the studio to access the files on the very central machine that they'd used and wiped clean, may have just provided the solution. So Galen went home and she checked, and yes, she did have a backup of the film. And that's all well and good. However, if anything happened to that one backup they had, between getting those files from her house back to the studio, they would have lost the last remnants of Toy Story 2. This was a very delicate operation. They wrapped up her computer, put it in blankets and pillows, and placed it on the back seat of her car, and drove back to the studio very, very carefully. This must have been one of the slowest drives ever to make sure that the computer was not damaged on the way back. As a matter of fact, Orin was in the back of the car securing the cargo, whilst Galen drove back to the studio with the computer in hand. Upon their return to the studio, a group of employees came out to the car, carefully lifted up the computer and carried it inside the studio like some sort of ancient pharaoh. This was delicate, people. They carefully placed it down, they turned it on, and the files were all intact. So they transferred the files and made sure that this time they had a backup, and thankfully they were able to recover the vast majority of the files that were lost. A very, very close call indeed. And I can imagine after this harrowing tale, they made about 50 backups of this to ensure that it never happened again. Galen's newborn son was pretty much the reason that the film still exists, as Galen admitted herself that if she wasn't a mother, she wouldn't have needed to have made the backup in the first place. That would be the claim to fame that her son would have, that they inadvertently saved Toy Story 2. Everything looked fine. We lost about a week of work, so those last 10 shots are the last week, but other than that, okay. This, of course, was a very, very lucky escape, but a cautionary tale, and something that I think we can all take away from. Whether it's writing a script for a new brain spill video, or you're working on a multi-million-dollar animation, the same principle still applies. Back up your damn work. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to be notified as soon as I upload my next video, be sure to hit the bell button. And if you've got any ideas for what topics you'd like me to discuss next, let me know down in the comments below. As always, sources used in the video will be in the description. Right, now that we've got Disney Plus, I'm going to go and sit down and rewatch Toy Story, just for old time's sake. And when I'm watching Toy Story 2, I'll remember the fact that this was almost a film that was never meant to be. So think about that next time you watch the film. I'll see you guys in the next video. Fantastic.